My name is Javed Nasir, and I am an artist. I consider myself an artist and a designer at IBM. And I've been, advocating for mental health for quite a while now, especially emotional intelligence as it relates to leadership. Now, although there's a lot going on, in the political climate in America and in Canada right now, especially with this pandemic, I wanted to take a little bit of a break. And since June is Men's Mental Health Month, I wanted to talk to you guys a little bit about masculinity, the effects of masculinity, and just wanted to talk a little bit about some concepts to help you kind of grapple with this idea. And I know that as a man, some of this stuff is fairly revolutionary, and I'm sure that the women watching are gonna roll their eyes because they've known this for quite some time. But yeah, so let's talk about masculinity and sort of what is it, as men, how many times, do you hear, things like be a man, or, bros before hoes, pick yourself up, get laid, stop crying, grow some balls. Like, these are things that we hear fairly often as men growing up. And so, within society, I think, we've reached this, a critical level of sort of violence and aggression in men, starting with things like bullying as teens, to domestic abuse, alcoholism, rape, even suicide, and this is, and at the epicenter, of this kind of, this major issue is this like confused ideal of masculinity. If you look at the stats alone, in America at least, 90% of all homicides are perpetrated by men. Most of the people that commit acts of domestic violence and abuse are men. Most people that are committing suicide are men. If you look at, in Canada, it's about 2 to 4 times higher. In America, it's 4 times higher. Places like in Finland and Russia, it's up to 7 times higher. So it's like across the board, we're seeing that on average, men are suffering. Men are suffering, and as a result of that, society suffers and women suffer. Right? This phenomenon, it's a direct correlation of the way that we treat emotionality with our young boys, and sort of how we raise them to adhere to societal norms, and what it means to be a man. So. And this in essence, is actually anything that rejects femininity, right? Because the thing is that the way that we're taught to be men is actually in opposition of femininity. There is no real definition of masculinity. It's really just what are traditionally feminine characteristics, which are tenderness, kindness, compassion, empathy, and these are in essence, traditionally speaking, they are what are considered feminine characteristics. And so what are boys told to do? Boys are essentially told, you should just do the opposite of that. So what is the opposite of that? Disconnectedness, not having empathy and the presence of an ego, not having compassion, being invulnerable, being the providers and, being strong and stoic and all that. And what happens is that the emotions in boys are suppressed. They're told as a society that this is what it means to be a man, and if you're not in that box, or if you don't fit it, you're not a man, and that's terrifying. That's terrifying as a boy to be told that you're not a man. So now we can sit here and say that, well, you know what, maybe boys are naturally more violent. Maybe there's a gene in us that makes us more aggressive, and this is just sort of the natural state of the man. But I don't believe that, and there's actually a lot of research to indicate that isn't necessarily true, and that it's actually our environment and our culture that dictates the way that we are, emotionally speaking. And one of these people is this professor. She's a Stanford professor, and she's an author as well, an author of the book. It's called When Boys Become Boys. Her name is Judy Chu, And so basically what she argues is that it's actually culture rather than our nature that incapacitates boys and their emotional and social skills, right? And so what she found, which was really interesting, is what she found is that it's around the age of 4 to 6 where young boys start to disassociate emotionally, and it's roughly around the same time that they start to understand things like be a man, boys don't cry, don't be a pussy, just things like that. They start to understand. They start to understand those kinds of commentary, and so essentially it stunts them. And so what ends up happening is that boys and girls actually follow very different trajectories in life. And essentially what ends up happening is that men follow down a more fear-based trajectory, and women follow a more love-based trajectory. And what I mean by that is, if we think about all of our emotions that you can think of, anything, like feelings of compassion and love and empathy, anger, fear, contempt, disgust, these can essentially boil itself down to either a love-based emotion or a fear-based emotion. And so boys typically, when they're told this kind of a narrative, they end up going down a fear-based narrative or a fear-based emotional journey. And because boys are told that masculinity is anything that opposes femininity, they follow the more like invulnerable path, whereas women follow a path of vulnerability. And vulnerability is interesting, right? Because vulnerability actually, if you guys know who Brené Brown is, I would definitely encourage you guys to check out her TED Talks. She talks a lot about how vulnerability is actually the key to happiness, because it's kind of the threshold, right? It's kind of the thing at the threshold of everything that we want in life, and that's stopping us from being happy. Being vulnerable makes you open to shame or rejection, and that's a fear that we have. We don't want to be rejected, but you have to make yourself vulnerable and allow yourself to the possibility of shame or rejection to get what we really want, right? Like the number of times that you don't approach that girl that you think is super cute because you're afraid you're going to get rejected, and 9 times out of 10, well, at least I know for myself, I don't take that chance because it's scary. We're wired to avoid these kinds of uncomfortable feelings, but at the end of vulnerability is where true happiness really lies. And so vulnerability is kind of the key to happiness. And if vulnerability is the key to that happiness, we're actually told, men are actually told that we have to be a man, you have to be invulnerable. And so that sets them down a more fear-based trajectory in life, which leads to, distance, anger, frustration, loneliness, and, these kind of repressed emotions long term, compounds. It compounds into something that's quite ugly, and it comes out in aggression and violence, domestic abuse, alcoholism, suicide, right? So it's very, very important to understand that. So I want to leave you guys with 3 kind of concepts that if you really, really master and understand, you'll have a much better shot, at kind of redefining your masculinity. So, before I get into that, the first thing I want to say is that you are not the way you are because that's just your personality. You have to understand that you are the way you are because of your experiences, because of your traumas, because of your culture, because of your upbringing, because of your parents. That is why you are the way that you are. You aren't the way that you are because, well, it's just my personality. Our minds are elastic. You can change these things. You can change behaviors. You can change patterns of thinking, and these are kind of where you start. So the first one I want to talk about is a narrative. Your narrative is essentially the truth that is in your mind about the world that you perceive. So it is just a collection of, all of your cultural baggage, your history, your experiences, all the movies you've watched, the music you listen to, everything that has happened to you in your life that's compounded now into, the number of years that you are, has developed a narrative of the world And the thing that you have to understand is that that isn't the reality. The reality is far from the narrative that we have been exposed to. And so to really master your narrative, we have to understand that every emotion that we experience, for the most part, can be trickled down into either a love-based emotion or a fear-based emotion. You have to be able to understand where your decision-making narrative is coming from. The decisions that you're making, are they based in some sort of an inherent fear? Am I afraid of looking stupid in front of my colleagues? Is that why I yelled at that person? Am I afraid of rejection? Like, did I maybe you cheated on your girlfriend because you were afraid that she would leave you, or you have an insecurity or something, right? And so you can kind of boil down your actions to a fundamental fear or a fundamental love. So to master your narrative, you have to understand that. You need to know and try to peel back the layers of the reasons why you're doing something, the reasons why you're responding to a situation. Really understanding, am I inherently afraid of something, and what is that fear and why? Or is this purely based in something that I'm doing because out of love, right? So that's the first thing. The second thing I want to talk about is emotional literacy. Now, emotional literacy really just means that we have a literacy and proficiency in the English language to express our world around us, but we need to have a literacy to explain what's happening internally, to explain the emotions that we're feeling, and to really like accurately predict that. And so what I mean by that is, like, imagine the color spectrum. As a designer, I deal a lot with colors and hues and saturations, and we have to accurately be able to communicate ideas. So if I'm trying to communicate to you that I have a green chair, now that could technically be accurate, but it's not as precise as it could be, because maybe the chair is teal, maybe the chair is aquamarine, or a different hue or saturation of that green. And so communicating that with a higher degree of literacy is going to communicate that to you better. You're going to have a better idea of what is actually going on. And we need to do the same thing with our emotions. We need to be able to express the different hues and saturations of emotions that we feel. It's not just fear or anger or joy or disgust. It's not just like those 5 universal emotions. We feel hues and saturations of each of those, and there's probably a spectrum of millions of different emotions. And there's even research into the way that our minds work, in that knowing words to certain emotions actually creates different emotions in our minds, and so we're able to feel a larger range of emotions if we really do have a higher degree of emotional literacy. Just knowing words to emotions, creates new emotions in our brains, and so that increases the range of what you can experience. That increases the range of how you experience the world around you, and how you express those feelings, which in essence it actually also purges those emotions in you. And of course, the last thing I want to talk about is vulnerability. Vulnerability is one of those tools that we have to really understand it, and to say, okay, I'm about to embark on this particular action, or this is something that I really want. I want this job. This is the dream job that I want, and I need to make myself vulnerable to be able to get it. And then if you peel it back to say, okay, why have I been putting this off, and why don't I apply to this job, or why don't I ask out this girl, or why am I not doing the thing that I want to do to get the thing that I want? Because it really boils down to, like, well, what if I'm not good enough? What if my application comes back and it's confirmed that I'm actually as dumb as I think I am? Or maybe I am actually as ugly as I think I am, or the thoughts that are in my head are actually real. Doing this will make the thoughts in my head real because the real world has told me that, right? And so then when you understand that, you can actually be like, okay, well, that's just my narrative, and what I'm making an assumption about. What do I need to qualify for this job? Let me obtain the skills. I am capable of doing these things. And I will do them, and then just even understanding that rejection has nothing to do with you, that it really is just about the external world. The circumstances of individual people, right? Getting rejected from a girl that you like doesn't mean that, you're not worthy of love. It just means that it wasn't right for her, We hear, toxic masculinity quite a bit. And I want like the men to understand that, I read this really like awesome quote, and I'll read it to you guys just so I don't like mess it up. To understand that toxic masculinity is not an argument that men are toxic by simply being men. It is a critique of the way men are expected to adhere to certain gender roles within society at large that fit within a traditionalist framework that forces men to be dominant and powerful, which in turn forces men to limit their emotional range down to faux stoicism and anger. So I thought that encapsulates it really well. There's no need to get defensive about it when you hear the concept of toxic masculinity. There's nothing wrong with you for inherently being a man. It's just defining the fact that we have been socialized this way, and we really need to be aware of that. We need to be aware of how we've been conditioned is not who we are, and that in fact it's hindering us from being who we are truly. And so I just wanted to remind people that true freedom and manhood lies in empathy. We have to be kind to each other. And it doesn't make you less of a man to be openly kind, to be demonstrative of your praise for people, to really show your appreciation, to show compassion, to show empathy for each other, to really understand that. And that I think is what's the most important thing about being a man. And being a man is just about who you are. Just be the best of who you can be, right? As men, we have to challenge those conventions. We have to challenge why we do things the way that we do, why we think the things that we think, and that ultimately will kind of unlock the secrets for yourself to be who you are, to be who you are. I think that's it. So that concludes. That concludes everything I've wanted to talk about with respect to masculinity. So thank you guys for listening.